Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. Today we're talking about, well, you saw the title. There's no need for me to introduce it. I shall simply introduce my guest, Caine, my guest and very good friend, Caine, who has joined me again. Previously, he joined me with a deep dive into British men's wardrobes. He joined me long ago on a deep dive into tea. And now, well, listen and see.
Hello, Caine. Thank you very, very much for joining me today.
Hello, Thomas. It's good to be back, and thankfully not so long this time since our last one, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we are here to talk trousers.
We absolutely are. If I could explain to your listeners how we got to this point. Just a couple of days ago, I was at work, and you know when you open up a new page on your browser, you're met with some of the headline stories from the news. And one of those stories scrolling across really jumped out at me. It was such a shocking headline, I think. And I clicked in and I read this story. And as soon as I read it, I realized that it was a really important moment in British political history. And the story was that it was reported in the Daily Mail that some people are claiming that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, is wearing suits that are too small for him. And I know for your listeners that it probably is shocking, so I'll give them a moment to let that settle in. That's what we're here to talk about today. As soon as I heard that story, I ran out of the office and I called Thomas, and like me, he was extremely shocked. And we decided that this was something that we would have to talk about in a podcast episode, because in years from now, you know, people will still be talking about this story and this moment, and we don't want to miss it. And you know, I also think that this is an opportunity to remind viewers that on this podcast, we don't shy away from the important topics, the controversial, hard-hitting things. We are willing to tackle them and be impartial, informative voices, I think. Would you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the real shock for me, the shock of Sunak's socks, because we can see his socks. Lots of men like to now show off their personality through their socks, no longer through a tie or pocket square or anything. His socks are rubbish, aren't they? I mean, just
yeah. Well, that's actually one of the pictures I saw when I was clicking through this article was from when he visited the Japanese Prime Minister, I think, and he was wearing red socks with the name of one of the Japanese baseball teams on it, which got him a lot of popularity in Japan. You know, it seems a little bit sycophantic to me, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that was the one instance of, you know, sock diplomacy. But like, he's not generally sending out signals with his socks, is he?
No, I mean, most of his socks are pretty plain, right? But the interesting thing is you can see his socks, and that's sort of the point that this article makes. In fact, if I could read the headline of the article for the listeners, so they know exactly what we're talking about. As I said, this was reported in the Daily Mail, and the headline is, "Why doesn't Rishi Sunak buy suits that fit? Men's fashion expert is baffled by the 5'6" Prime Minister's attempt to look trendy with his ankle-skimming tailoring." That's the headline there, and then the article goes on to discuss the Prime Minister, the fact that apparently his suits are too small, specifically that his trousers are too short, and then it has some commentary from a men's fashion expert who I don't know who he is, but I mean, I don't follow really men's fashion in any serious way, but nevertheless, he is apparently an expert. He has a lot of followers on Twitter, and it's his comments about what he thinks about the Prime Minister and why he's wearing these trousers that are too short and that he needs to change that, basically.
Yeah, so this is a Daily Mail story, as we're being very open about.
Yes, yeah. And just to be 100% clear, we're not going to try and get into any politics here. We really are focusing on the important stuff, you know, international relations, diplomacy, politics, that kind of stuff. Those are interesting, but I think they are down the scale in importance compared to Rishi Sunak's suits and his trouser length. So
totally agree.
Why don't we start then with the premise of the article, that he's wearing suits that are too small for him, right? I think perhaps we can begin with that rather than just discussing why that might be. Maybe we can challenge that premise. Are his suits too short, right? Does this fashion expert, and other people, by the way, it's not just this fashion expert, he's the one quoted in the article, but there are many other people apparently on social media discussing this. What do you think, Thomas? You've looked at some pictures. I did a Google image search as well. What do you think? Do you think his suits are too small?
Obviously, the trousers are cut a bit shorter than I would. prefer. However, if you look at the suit overall, right, they fit on the shoulders. The sleeve length is fine. He hasn't gone out and bought a suit a size too small. That would look really, really different. So this is a deliberate stylistic choice.
Okay, so you're of the opinion that the premise perhaps is wrong then. He's not wearing suits that are too small. That's what you'd say.
Yeah. I think it's his taste to have the trousers as they are.
I think it's an interesting question, right? Because before you can say someone is wearing a suit that's too small, you have to decide how a suit should fit. And that's not obvious because there are many ways that a suit can fit. And of course, there's personal preference. What do you find comfortable? Some people find much baggier, more comfortable. Some people find much tighter, more comfortable, and so on. I haven't done any research into Rishi Sunak's wardrobe, by the way. All I've done is I read this article and I did a quick image search. I just image searched Rishi Sunak suits. And I have to say, in the article, they choose pictures which accentuate how short his trousers are. So most of the pictures, for example, that are used are ones of him sitting down. And I think anybody who has wore dress trousers knows that when you sit down, they do ride up, don't they? You know, especially if you've been sitting for a long time, maybe you slouch down a little bit, they can ride up quite high. So I don't think those images are necessarily fair representations of how short his trousers are. However, if you do image search, you can see him standing up, and that's a fair representation of the length of his trousers. And they are cut just above the ankle, as far as I can tell. I mean, you know, it's hard to see exactly. I'm looking at the picture now, but I would guess like where the sort of bone, the notch is on your ankle, I would say it's about there. So you can see maybe about half an inch of the sock, even when he's standing, which some people I agree would say is a bit short. But is it too short? Is it a mistake? I think that's quite debatable. Interestingly, in the article, as apparently evidence of how short his trousers are and the fact that they're too short, they actually have a little clip of a video of him sitting down chatting with Joe Biden. And in the video, you see the camera focus on his trousers, and they are quite high up his ankle. The funny thing is, though, Joe Biden's trousers are exactly the same. And they're not saying that Joe Biden's trousers are too short. So again, I'm not saying it's like a political statement or anything, but it does kind of show that if you take a picture of a man sitting down in dress trousers, they're, you know, unless they're really, really long, almost I would say overly long, they are going to be high up the ankle. That's just how trousers look when you sit down, right?
Oh yeah. And I used to work with someone from the deep south of the United States. He was very much the southern gentleman. Would go to the same tailor, and he had trousers cut to what I think is the right length, but he would sit and kind of expose his sock because he would express personality through socks, right? If want the Mona Lisa on a sock, he has the Mona Lisa on a sock. Want a pizza topping sock, he has those socks.
He's got
right?
it.
So, exactly. So he would rarely announce his presence through socks and other ways. But these guys aren't doing it. I haven't looked at Joe Biden's socks.
They look I haven't either. In the clip that's in the article, they look like normal socks. I think they're dark.
Yeah. And the same for Rishi Sunak. Like he's not doing this to expose his socks.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like why he's doing it, right? So I still think, are they too short though? I mean, I still think that's a question that hasn't quite been answered, because I think it is fair to say that they're shorter than a lot of people might wear their trousers. But does that mean it's too short? And you know, I think it really depends on what kind of cut that you like and what kind of style that you like. You said you like your trousers a little bit longer. Where would you usually like the break then on the bottom of your trousers?
The second lace hole. That if I'm standing with both feet on the floor, standing up straight.
If you're standing with both feet on the floor as opposed to hopping on one leg, yeah.
Exactly. Well, like you say, there's a lot of movement, right? So it can be debatable. Like you sometimes see shots of men, you know, walking along the Daily Mail's outrage that they're, again, the same kind of article, but it's because they're moving, right? As soon as they're standing still, it's different. But yeah, I think that's the standard for what I would consider classic. Obviously, not classical. Go back to the 17th or 18th century, it might be very different. But you know, post-war tailoring, second lace hole of the shoes. Again, we actually did that podcast episode talking about British men's wardrobes, and we talked about different types of shoes. So I tend to wear ankle boots, so that might influence it a bit. But even then, it's kind of second lace hole of like a normal derby shoe.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, and I definitely think that's that's 100% correct about what you said, that to conform with that kind of era, that post World War II, that, you know, that era is generally called the golden age of menswear, and it's broadly speaking, you know, to take the broadest definition, you're talking of 30s, 40s, and 50s, and that era set the standard, I think, that many people still follow today. But also, it is only one era, and it's one sub-style within British menswear. If you go back to the 1910s, which I know is a long time ago now, it's over it's over 100 years ago. But nevertheless, if you go back to the 1910s and you look at pictures from menswear magazines and stuff like that, you'll see the trousers are much tighter and cut quite high. Yeah. They're not that baggier, slightly longer cut that is more popular during the golden age of menswear. Also, I think we should also remember that, menswear, as we mentioned in that episode that you and I recorded, it has its origins in the British Isles, but today it's a global phenomenon, and there are different cuts and different styles all over the world. The three main ones are British, Italian, and American. And generally speaking, they're on a spectrum where American is the sort of most baggy, the fullest cut, right? The Brooks Brothers popularized that sack cut suit, which is very baggy, which, by the way, I would say, if you look at how Jacob Rees-Mogg dresses, he seems to prefer that sort of almost sack cut, right? Like baggier cut suit. And then British is below that. British is generally like, these are really, I'm really painting very broad strokes here, but tighter, smaller than American. But then you have Italian, which is at the other end of the spectrum, where Italian cut suits are significantly tighter than American cut suits, and generally will have higher cut trousers on the ankles. And so, Rishi Sunak is obviously, as many people have pointed out, he is a cosmopolitan guy, right? He travels all over the world. He has lived in different countries. Maybe he's just conforming more to the Italian cut. Perhaps he likes the Italian cut. That's the kind of thing that he likes. And as a result, he wears tights with short trousers, right?
Just to cut in here, not to, Alex Jones.
Jones?
Alex Jones.
Infowars.
Where he goes, I'm looking at you, globalist. I mean, by any definition, I think it would be fair to call Rishi Sunak a bit of a global figure.
Yeah,
right.
He's a global cosmopolitan guy. So why are we assuming that he is only trying to conform to British styles? And if he's not conforming to British styles, then that is somehow wrong, right?
And just to lean in here, because obviously the British style has been fairly consistent. The American sack suit's been fairly consistent. Now we consider Italy, the shorter trousers and tighter. But obviously in the 90s, Pierce Brosnan played Bond, and he had Brioni's suits. It's a particular house style, of course, but they had built-up shoulders and they're a lot bigger. So Italy seems to have changed, because I've looked up articles on the Italian style. It's all over the place, depending on where they're drawing from, which Italian city, which era. It seems to be the most malleable. Yeah,
definitely. And, as I said, painting with very broad strokes. And also, I'm a bit of an enthusiast, I'd say, in menswear. I'm definitely not any sort of expert. But from what I'm aware, there are, of course, differences within Italy as well. The biggest differences are between Milan and Napoli. Anyway, and of course those would have changed over time, just as British styles and American styles change over time. Like I said, the 1910s versus the golden era of menswear is very different, And in the 1910s, very normal to have tight, higher cut trousers, whereas the golden era was much more of that fuller suit, baggier suit, which many people would still say is the standard. But I do think it's worth pointing out that it's not so easy to say someone's suit is cut wrong. And I have to say, when I look at Rishi Sunak's suits, they don't look cut wrong to me. I don't know.
Okay.
What do you think? Okay. Do they look wrong to you?
It's a style, right? So I see it as a style in the same way, to an extreme. I see a punk, and I can tell a well put together punk and a poorly put together punk.
Right.
It's not my personal style, right? So he is well put together for a style that I'm not going to wear.
Yeah, okay. All right. So you wouldn't have your suits cut the way Rishi Sunak does, but you don't think his suits are cut incorrectly?
No, it's a style. And, again, obviously I did some articles, last year, right, when we had the 3 prime ministers in a few months. And so I was doing a lot of research, and it was difficult to get away from how expensive his suits are, right? There's no way I couldn't cover it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think he's probably the first modern prime minister, I guess. And again, I haven't researched this, but he's probably the first modern prime minister who himself appears to be a menswear enthusiast, right?
Oh, and yeah.
Now, look, Rishi Sunak is not short of money. So for him, £4,000 isn't a lot to spend on a suit. It would be, pennies, right? It would be like you and I finding a bargain for £20 or something. But nevertheless, you have to choose to spend that money. He could buy something just off the rack or tailored to fit. He doesn't have to be going to the best tailors and getting bespoke suits, right? And even
Oh,
though it's
yeah.
not expensive, it is nevertheless time consuming to have a suit tailored, right?
Yeah, it is time consuming, and he must. I'm going to guess he enjoys it and has input. It just looks like that.
Yeah, I mean, the suits that he wears, again, this is based purely on a quick Google image search and the fact that some of the images show the labels of the suits. And so you can identify where he's gone to have it tailored. And there, many of those suits are going to be around the £3,000 to £4,000 mark. So, like I said, it's not big money to him. He's an extremely rich man. But nevertheless, he doesn't have to spend that kind of money, right? And rich people don't get rich writing checks, do they? So I'm sure if he could get it for cheaper and he wanted to, he would spend less money.
And it's something that we've both lived in China, and this cut is kind of familiar to us.
Yeah, actually, that brings me on to the next thing that I thought we could talk about after we discuss whether or not we think that it is too short. I think are we both in agreement then that we don't think it is necessarily too short?
It's a choice.
Yeah, it's shorter
than
many people would have their suits cut. But it doesn't follow that because it's shorter, it's too short, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then in which case, I think, the next thing to question would be, well, why does he have his suits cut that way? Because the article claims, there's a few claims made in the article about why he has his suits cut this way. And one of the claims, which is, I think, what you're alluding to, is that he's conforming to a style. However, it's a sort of outdated popular fashion trend from the early noughties, right, from the early 2000s. And as you mentioned, that sort of early 2000s style that the fashion expert referenced in the article seems to be referring to, well, firstly, it doesn't seem outdated to me, because when I look around, it still seems to be a very popular style. So we're talking here, listeners, maybe you can go, if you Google something like early 2000s suit, skinny suit, something like that, you'll probably see the kind of thing that we're talking about. And what we're talking about is a suit that generally is very tight fitting. The trousers are cut quite high on the ankles, skinny fit or very slim fit trousers. You also have very thin lapels. They're often worn with very thin ties. The whole thing is just thin overall.
Yeah.
And that style actually seems still quite popular. I noticed a lot of people wearing that. And as you pointed out, in China, would you say that was your experience as well? In China, if you saw people in suits, that's the kind of suit they'd be wearing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my regular tailor knows my style. On one occasion, it was my tailor's niece who was running the shop. And so the jacket I got was one that was a lot tighter, shorter in the sleeves. And it was very much, I say, the Chinese style that I see. And it's nice to have one cut that way, which is why I won't say it was the wrong style. Although it was better worn with trousers that kind of matched.
Yeah, okay. And you didn't have the matching trousers. So
I had to get some chinos because it's a nice linen jacket.
Yeah.
But
Well, when I first went to get some suits tailored with the tailor that I went to in China, I actually had to explain to her that I'm not a big fan of that cut, because I knew that was most of the suits she's making are for young Chinese men getting married. And so they're all cut to conform with the most popular style for young Chinese men, which, as far as I could tell from being there, it was that style. It was that style that was also popular amongst many young men back in the early 2000s, and I still think actually popular amongst a lot of young men in the UK, but perhaps less so. And it's, as we described earlier, but it's not my cup of tea. And so I had to say, I want it longer. And a couple of times when she said it, when I said it to her, it wasn't that she was confused, but she wanted to make sure that I was sure. And that was another thing as well, because some people are saying that Rishi Sunak is, making a mistake, right? He's making a bad choice. He doesn't know a lot about fashion's menswear. And I find that hard to believe, partly because he's going to the best tailors in the world. And when you go to a tailor, it's not just you telling them what to do. You're not just barking orders at them. It's very much a back and forth. They're giving you advice. They're telling you whether they think, based on their many years of experience, what you want is going to look good. And if they think it won't look good, if they're a good tailor, they'll tell you to make another choice. I mean, ultimately, you're employing them. And if you've got enough money, they will make anything you want, right? Everyone's got a price. But generally speaking, when you go to a tailor, if you say, I want this cut with, I want a double-breasted suit cut with short sleeves, they're going to be like, are you sure? That's not usually how people would have double-breasted suits, right? And
there's a difference between a house style and costuming tailoring, right? So costuming tailoring might give you all kinds of wacky things, like the Alan Partridge safari suit that he wore on the red carpet, which is like a blend of various different early 70s Roger Moore things all into one outfit. It looks wild. That's clearly a costumier's tailor. But my experience has been the more honestly, the more expensive the tailor, the more likely they are to fight back and say no, or potentially even say, that's not my style, go down the road.
Yeah, because if they're putting their name to it, right? Especially if you're one of the Savile Row tailors or something, you're putting your name to it. It's a brand. It's brand recognition. You don't want people walking around in a suit that looks very strange, doesn't look good, and saying, "Oh, I got this cut at so and so's," because then it might discourage other people from going to that place, right? And so when I first went to my tailor and we were measuring up for the trousers, and I was saying I wanted them a bit longer and a bit fuller than she would usually make. She did, she double checked me a few times and she was like, "You sure that would be," she would say, she was quite polite. So she would say, "That's very special." She was okay in the end. I got them made pretty much the way I wanted.
I did have the wonderful reaction from my tailor once when I described something I liked. And I think she said with that thing, "Yeah, all the old English guys like that." I'm okay.
Well, there you go. Not too bad.
But she knew, again, that's a Cantonese tailor is used to the two markets, right? Shenzhen on the mainland and Hong Kong, where the more traditional English, and at the moment, the more traditional English, the better for that market. That's why they're always able to get, down to the second lace. And, we've talked about the length of the trousers. There's also the height of the waistband, which has changed a lot since the Second World War.
Yeah, definitely. And that's another interesting point, actually, because the other argument, so there's the argument that he's made a mistake. He just doesn't really know much, which I think that one definitely isn't the case, because he's going to, even if he didn't know anything, he's going to people who know, right? He's going to absolute experts, and they're not going to let him walk out with a very strange looking suit, right, with their name on it. So I don't think it's a mistake. I definitely think it's an intentional choice. So the next thing is, he's conforming to this outdated style from the early 2000s. But as you pointed out about things like the waistband, well, that early 2000s style, that style which is still popular actually amongst many young men. I mean, even calling it an early 2000s style, that's what they say in the article. I'm not convinced it's an early 2000s style. It seems to be still popular today. But it has a very low rise, right? The belt would be well below your belly button, very far below your belly button. And if you look at Rishi Sunak's trousers, it's a weird phrase, isn't it? If you look at Rishi Sunak's trousers, if you look at pictures of Rishi Sunak's trousers, what you see is they are lower rise than some people would have. And I prefer my trousers slightly higher rise, although not quite as high as, the really classic style from the sort of golden era. But his trousers are not really low rise. They're not really, really far below his belly button. They're somewhat lower, but they're not really low. And so it doesn't seem to me that he's actually conforming with this, whatever you'd call it. I don't know what the name is, this early, for want of a better name, this early 2000s style.
Yeah. And it's something from Matt Spazer's blog, The Suits of James Bond, that when you start changing one detail of the suit, it starts to have an effect on the others because it's one garment. Right? So when I look at Rishi Sunak, the one garment kind of does fit. It works all together. Yeah,
it's not odd, right? It's not out of place. Yeah. And it, like I said, it definitely doesn't seem to conform to this style which the article claims it does. That's basically the sort of the conclusion of the article is he's following this outdated style. He used to be trendy 20 years ago, and he's just continued to wear the same clothes, and he's no longer trendy. And I don't think that's really the case for the reasons that we said, and also the fact that to say that's not trendy anymore, I'm not sure about that. Now, personally, I don't try and wear clothes that are trendy, so I'm not making any comment on whether he should or should not be trendy. But the idea that style is out of trend, as I've said a number of times, and I don't want to labor the point, but I don't think that's correct. And besides the fact that it's still extremely popular in China, as far as I can tell, amongst young men at least, it is different with older men. They wear quite different clothes. But amongst young men who wear suits to weddings and stuff like that, it still seems very popular. Also in the UK, quite recently, as part of my job, I went to observe and help with a couple of graduation ceremonies. Not just a couple, actually, a few different graduation ceremonies. And firstly, the interesting thing about the graduation ceremonies and the way that people are dressed is that I would say probably only about 80% of the young men that were there graduating wore suits, right? There were okay. I would say 20% of them were wearing things that weren't suits. And that could be anything. There were some people who were just wearing t-shirts and, dark jeans, and there were other people wearing just, say, a shirt and trousers. But only about maybe 75-80% of the people wearing anything that you could call a suit. And of that 80%, and I'm not saying none of them were wearing suits that would really conform to the classic rules of menswear, but I don't think I saw a single person where I could say their entire outfit conformed to the sort of the standard classic rules of menswear. So that's just an interesting observation about how much menswear has changed, that even at a graduation ceremony, that I would probably say for a normal person, graduation ceremony is probably up there with top 3 most formal events you're ever going to attend, right? Wedding, funeral, graduation ceremony. I can't think of much more. I mean, job interview, but a job interview is less formal than a graduation ceremony, right? For most jobs. But nevertheless, most of the young men weren't wearing suits that really conformed wholly, at least. However, what many of those young men were wearing were suits that conformed to that style that, according to the Daily Mail article, is apparently an early 2000s style. So, but that's why I don't think it is, because as far as I can tell, when I looked around, most of them were wearing slim-fitting trousers, cut high on the ankles, thin lapels, a higher seat on the suit jacket, often thin ties. So I don't think it's out of style. I think if your goal is to be a bit trendy, then it's probably the right sort of suit to wear. That's not my goal when I dress. I just want to look not stupid, really. But, if your goal is to look trendy, then I don't think you would be off trend by conforming to that style.
Absolutely. And I am curious because, you went to a tailor fairly recently, right? So you had your first tailored experience. So I'm interested in hearing a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was fairly recently. I think everything feels recent because the whole pandemic stuff has kind of stopped, messed with our perception. So yeah, it feels recently, but actually, I guess it was 4 and a bit years ago now, which isn't that recent. Yeah.
That was COVID time haze.
Exactly. Yeah. So it wasn't that recent, but it does feel kind of recent. I agree. And yes, I did. My first experience of going to a tailor's was in China, and it's something I've been wanting to do for quite some time, particularly because it's relatively affordable in China. And I knew that when I returned to the UK, it's extremely unlikely I'd be in a position to get bespoke tailored suits. At best, I might be able to get a seamstress to, take in the waist a bit, but I wouldn't be able to get anything bespoke made. And before then, I'd already started wearing clothes that were, broadly speaking, in line with what you'd consider classic menswear styles, but very basic stuff, just essentially just wearing shirts, chinos, stuff like that, right? But I'd wanted to go actually get some suits tailor-made for me, and I went to a tailor's, and I actually went to a few tailors, and something that you point out was the house style, right? I went to 3 different tailors, and the reason I went to so many and ended up choosing the one I did wasn't purely based on price, although of course price was a factor, but it was because the one that I went to was the only one where I walked in, and when you walk into a tailor's, they always have suits on display, right? Partly it might be suits that need to be picked up by a customer, but it's also to sort of show the kind of suits that they make, right? And the one that I chose was the only one that most of the suits they had on display seemed to conform broadly with those kind of classic menswear styles that interested me. The others that I went to seemed much more modern. They seemed to be more experimental, doing things that didn't really conform to those traditional styles. They're very, very slim cuts, as I mentioned before, which is very popular in China. And most, you've got to remember, most tailors in China, in fact, I dare say probably all tailors in China, 99% of their customers are young men getting married, right? So they're making wedding suits, and that's probably, I suppose, the same in the UK. But in the UK, you'd have more people perhaps making business suits and so on. But these, the Chinese word for a suit is Western suit, right? That's what it means. So they consider it a Western fashion item. It's not something that's part of their dress culture. They generally wear suits unless their company requires it, which is rare. They're generally wearing full suits only for a wedding, and they're mostly matching that style that we've described before. And the other tailors that I went to, they weren't my cup of tea. Whereas when I walked into the tailor that I eventually went to, I mean, even the decor, they'd done a good job. They'd made the interior of their shop look like a kind of old-fashioned classic, what you'd have in your mind when you think of a tailor's dark wood, books on the shelves. And I know, of course, all of that is just superficial, right? They couldn't, they couldn't read the books. They were in English, right? they didn't speak any English. But, so I understand it was designed to attract customers like me. But nevertheless, they know the kind of customer they want, right? They know the kind of person to be doing tailoring for, and I'm that kind of customer, and that's why I chose them. And I'm really glad I did, because they were extremely helpful, extremely polite. I was quite happy with the suits that I got, and they're still suits that I wear. And also I made a point of, I got 3-piece suits, and I got an extra sport coat, and I got a number of shirts so I can mix and match. So actually, some of my colleagues at work were quite surprised when I told them how few suits and shirts I own, because they said it looks like I own loads and loads of different clothes. But it's just that if you get different things, if you get like a couple of 3-piece suits, maybe a couple of sport jackets, get them in different colors, get them in different levels of formality, get a number of different shirts, get a few different ties, you can end up with quite a small wardrobe that looks like you have a very large wardrobe, right?
Yes, absolutely. I've got too many suits now to go with that approach, but if I'd known before. But I'm very curious because in China, a lot of men, well, I see this with young men in the UK, and I see it with a lot of guys in China, right? Almost universally, is they will go for a black suit.
Yeah, when I went to the graduation ceremonies recently that I assisted at as part of my job, it was the same. I would say that of the people wearing suits, you know, the vast majority, probably 90%, went for black. And it's not something that I can't imagine any situation where I'd wear a black suit unless I was getting married, like my own wedding or a funeral. You know, but even at my own wedding, I might choose I'm more likely going to choose a grey. But nevertheless, a lot of people do go for black suits because I'm not sure why, actually.
It just seems to be a thing, right? So when I first went to a tailor, I was a young man myself. And so I was like, yeah, get a black suit. And my parents were like, what, for a funeral? And they were absolutely no. So I had to go several shades lighter. In fact, I think I was going for the next shade to black. And they were like, that's literally called Vicar Grey. So I went for a dark grey. And I think was my first tailored suit. But it does seem to be a thing that for young men it is go for black. And now it would be the John Wick thing, but that wasn't a thing when I was looking at them.
Yeah, I suppose there's that, right? There's the influence of films when you and I were growing up, films like Reservoir Dogs and so on. But even those films are kind of exceptions, because if you look back to some of the, you know, you're saying about John Wick, so suddenly it's got into my head like, well, yeah, younger people, particularly young men, often like action films, stuff like that. But if you look back, though, many of those great action films like Chinatown, LA Confidential, they have incredible suits, right? The wardrobes. Yeah. People on those films did really great jobs, but none of them were wearing black suits, right? They're all wearing suits that match. And interestingly, though, actually, just this is completely sort of stream of consciousness stuff. If you watch Hong Kong cinema from the 80s and the 90s, but the 80s in particular, and Hong Kong cinema, action cinema from the 80s has had a huge impact on the Western action genre in a way that you probably wouldn't be aware of if you're not a fan of Hong Kong cinema. But I mean, to the point where many famous Western gangster films are almost copies of older Hong Kong films. But in those films, the characters are almost always wearing black suits. So I wonder if that, for example, Reservoir Dogs is very, very, very heavily inspired by the film City on Fire, which is a really great Hong Kong gangster film. And so I wonder if perhaps the reason why the Reservoir Dogs characters are all wearing black suits, black ties, is because Quentin Tarantino was heavily inspired by those older Hong Kong gangster films. But of course, we've only moved ourselves one step backwards. We still don't know why that black suit is. we haven't got to that final step, so I'm not sure.
That is interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much. We've talked about Rishi Sunak's trousers. We've talked a little bit about our own trousers. Any other trousers that we wish to discuss for today?
No, I think we're all trousered out.
If you'd like more from Caine, of course, you can find him on my podcast. You can find him on a deep dive into British men's wardrobes. You can find him on our Christmas episode. You can find him on our shallow dive into St. George's Day. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.